everybody, and welcome to the Quarantine-ish Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so happy to be back with you tonight for the first of our spring series of QBTs. If you are new to JWA and the Quarantine Book Talks, thank you for joining us. And if you have been with us for months, even possibly to have been with us for a year, welcome back. Please introduce yourself in the chat box. Make sure to chat to panelists and attendees so we can all see. And also, as we're talking later, please add your questions to the conversation. We are delighted to be able to continue offering this program and growing this community. And I want to also thank jewishLIVE for their partnership. As many of you are aware, today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. I am really grateful for this meaningful way to acknowledge the ongoing presence of this history, and the loss and suffering and bravery and resilience it represents in our people and in our world. And I also want to acknowledge the painful absence, not only of those who were murdered, but of their missing contributions and generations. I appreciate this opportunity to mark Yom HaShoah together, exploring the ways that the story of the Holocaust is still unfolding and the stories of Jewish women with these new layers of discovery. I am delighted to introduce Judy Batalion, our guest tonight, whose new book, The Light of Days, The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos, is our topic for tonight. I have it right here. Judy is a writer, speaker, and editor. She holds a PhD in art history and has at times worked as a curator, researcher, comic, dramaturge, and more. She's written about these experiences and other topics in many publications, including the New York Times. Some of you may have seen her op-ed in the Sunday Review the other week, the Washington Post, Vogue, The Forward, Salon, Jerusalem Report, among many other, Jerusalem Post, among others, and also in her book, White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between, which was actually a JWA book pick in 2016. Judy is currently co-writing the screenplay for The Light of Days for Steven Spielberg's production company. Welcome, Judy.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really delighted to be here.
So there is so much to talk about with your book. It reveals so many stories that we just haven't heard before, or many of us haven't heard before. Why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about how you found yourself into this project?
Happily. Well, first of all, before I talk, I want to actually thank you again from the JWA, because I just want to highlight this, and then I'll come back to it. But I could not have done this project without the Jewish Women's Archive. The Encyclopedia of Jewish Women that is on your website and that you produced was a foundational source for me for this work. So not only am I very honored to be here talking to all of you tonight, I truly I do a lot of interviews and I do not usually open with this, but I truly could not have done this project without your scholarship and your offering. So thank you. Now I will begin answering. Sorry.
We love that our resources can help get projects like this underway, and we're about to launch in June a new expanded and revised version of our encyclopedia. So there will be even more there to discover.
Now I took us totally off track because I needed to thank you for that and to make known how important you were to this project. And now I will tell you how it all began. And it all began 14 years ago. In April 2007, someone today was talking to me and they called it an odyssey. And I said, yes, this project has felt like an odyssey. It was 2007 and I was living, let me rewind even and say that this project began by accident. This was a serendipitous discovery. I never, ever would have intended to write this book. Okay, now to catch you up with myself. It was 2007 and I was living in London at the time. And it was a time in my life where I was exploring elements of my Jewish identity. I myself am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I was very interested in what I was calling the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, the way that trauma passes through generations. And in my own life, really, I was particularly interested in the issue of danger and how I personally perceived and reacted to danger, and I felt that my Holocaust heritage really shaped that and influenced that. And I wanted to explore this issue. At the time, I was doing a lot of performing, and I decided to write a performance piece about Jewish women who had confronted danger. And I wanted it to be rooted in history, not just imagination. And so the first woman to come to mind, a strong Jewish woman who had faced danger, was Hannah Senesh. And Hannah Senesh, if for those who don't know her, she was a young Hungarian Jew, about 20 years old, who before World War II made Aliyah, moved to what was then Palestine. But during World War II, decided to go back. She joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper. She volunteered to go back and fight the Nazis. And I'd studied Hannah Senesh in 5th grade. And I'd always sort of remembered her and learned about her as a hero, a symbol of Jewish courage. But I was interested now in 2007, not so much in Hannah Senesh, the hero, but Hannah Senesh, the person. Like, who does that? Who chooses to go back to Nazi-occupied Europe? What psychology, what type of person does that? What is their psychology? What is their personality? I wanted to really understand her as a figure. And I went to the British Library to do research. I was living in London, and I ordered whatever books I could find on Hannah Senesh. There were not that many books on Hannah Senesh at the British Library. So I just ordered them all, basically. I went to pick up my stack, and in the stack, there was, one of the books was quite unusual. Like, it was old and dusty and had a blue fabric cover, and it was also in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But even more unusual than the book, perhaps, is the fact that I speak Yiddish. So I was able to read this. So I start just flipping through this book, an artifact, I thought it was, and looking for Hannah Senesh, but I couldn't find her. She was in the last 5 pages. In front of her, there were dozens of tales, short bits with photographs of other young Jewish women who had fought the Nazis. And the titles of the chapters were things like Ammunition, The Battle in Vilna, Partisan Combat. There was an Ode to Guns. And this really jolted me. It was nothing like the Holocaust narrative that I'd ever heard before. It was so different. And that's where this all began. That's my very long answer to how this all began.
Well, one of the things that's so interesting about it is that, as someone who studies women's history, on some level, it's not surprising to me that there were sources that just were not known, right? That it's not, often people think, oh, well, women's history doesn't exist because we don't have the materials, the stories haven't been written down. And sometimes that's true. But there's also a ton of material out there that just somehow gets overlooked. So we'll get to what the stories were that you found, but why hadn't we heard these stories before? Why is it that this book was sitting there dusty in the British Library, and it turns out, as I know from your book, was published in, Hebrew and in English and in Yiddish, and yet in the 40s, and yet somehow wasn't known?
So first of all, this Yiddish book was published in 1946. And what I didn't know at the time was it was a collection of almost snippets, excerpts, clippings from mostly Hebrew publications from 44, 45, newspapers and obituary books. And the idea was it was translated into Yiddish specifically for American Jews to know these incredible stories of young Jewish women in the war. Mostly in Poland. The book focused on Poland. And so, as you were saying, yes, there was, in particular in the 40s, there was this writing, there was raw material, there were full memoirs had been published at the time. Why we don't know this story widely, that became like, I don't want to say subtext, it became like the sub question of all my research. So on the one hand, I was trying to figure out what happened, what is the story, but alongside that, connected to that, I was constantly trying to figure out what happened to the story. why did I not know about young Jewish women who are blowing up German trains? How did that slip by? And I came to understand that there are many reasons why this history was silenced or repressed for a long time. And I do get into this at the end of the book, and it's a complicated picture, and I as you could, I don't want to speak too much about it, but there are reasons, and these reasons are partially zeitgeist, having to do with what people are interested in hearing about the Holocaust at different times in history. Partially, these are political reasons, that the narrative of the Holocaust was shaped to tell certain stories, in particular in Israel and in Poland. And then partially, these are personal reasons. Many of the women, first of all, most of these people were killed. So their stories, for most of them, though a few diaries did survive, for most of them, the stories died with them. But for those who survived, many of them were not believed. Many of them were accused of either sleeping their way to safety, of fleeing to fight instead of taking care of their parents. I heard again and again, there's kind of this there was an idea that if the pure souls had perished, but if you survived, it's because you collaborated or you did something. And all these reasons made women retract their stories or not tell them. These women also, especially who I write about, they suffered from terrific survivor's guilt. And they, even when they were ready to tell their stories, even when they wanted to, these were women who, I mean, they suffered trauma and then were, smuggling explosives to ghettos and forests. They had incredible wartime stories, but they felt that compared to their survivor peers who had been at Auschwitz or who had been in camps, they'd had it easy. And that also stopped a lot of them from talking more openly. They felt they somehow hadn't suffered enough to merit telling their story. And then finally, there's also, silence was also a means of coping. And, for most of the characters who I write about, the figures, they were in their early 20s when the war was over. They had their whole lives ahead of them, and they had nothing, no family, no home, no nationality. And they had to start fresh in new countries. And I think, like many refugees, there was, a desire to move on, to move forward. And then, of course, there were women. Many of them felt a real duty to have children, to populate the world with Jews again, to recreate families. And they wanted to create happy, normal environments. So all these many reasons sort of combine to create a repression of this narrative for many decades.
One of the things I thought was interesting also that you talk about in the book is that one of the roles that women had in the movement was the sort of as the storytellers. It was their job to kind of document what happened, and that then when they, we often think that women are left out of history because men write the narrative, and that's mostly true. But in these cases where women sometimes were writing the narrative, they then felt like they shouldn't be foregrounding their own story. They should write about other people, and they left themselves out of the narrative then because it seemed, selfish to focus on their own story.
Yeah, and even there was also, especially some of the early writers, they felt that they wanted to tell an objective story of the Holocaust. They didn't want to write a memoir because they felt that they wouldn't be believed, or that wouldn't count. So they wrote the personal out of the story in order to count as historical record.
It's so interesting, all the ways that, all these documents can exist, and yet it can be so hard to tell one's own story or to figure out how to put oneself into the narrative. So tell us a little bit about what kinds of roles women played and why they took on these significant roles in the resistance.
Sure. So first of all, my book focuses really on Poland and women in Poland. And I really, the resistance roles, I said, like, span the gamut. I mean, women were did social work, so ran soup kitchens, helped orphans, ran education, secret schools. There were all kinds of secret education programs, seminars. There was an underground medical school. There were cultural programs, and there was, secret printing presses. And so some of the work was cultural, all of it illegal. Some of it, women wrote underground bulletins, underground newspapers. They wrote even for other resistance newspapers. They edited these underground papers. They distributed them. Some of the women had more physical or violent roles. They blew up Nazi supply trains. They were saboteurs. They were guerrilla fighters in ghetto uprisings, flinging Molotov cocktails and throwing explosives on Nazi tanks. Some of them were assassins and shot Gestapo men. And many of the women that I focus on in this story were what were called Courier Girls, or Kishariot in Hebrew, which means connectors. And they basically pretended to be Christian. They had a good look, and I'll come back to how they did that. But they were able to, they had to leave the ghettos. And what they did is first of all, they connected the ghettos. The ghettos Jews weren't allowed to have radios. They weren't allowed to have newspapers. So it was young Jewish women that were bringing information. They were slipping out of ghettos. This is earlier in the war, and telling Jews in ghettos what was going on in the war. They were the ones bringing the information about the Nazis' genocidal plan. They were telling people about this. And then they smuggled educational materials. They smuggled books. And then as their movements became militias, they started to arm them. And these women met with arms dealers, or they had many other ways of procuring weapons. They purchased weapons. They then, hid them in their clothes, in their handbags, in their body, and taped to their torso, and would smuggle weapons into ghettos and to partisan units. They also smuggled fake IDs, money, and they also smuggled people, and they helped rescue. There are a number of rescue networks where women were very involved in finding Jews' hiding places, coming to check up on the Jews in hiding, bringing them medical help, paying their hiders. So yes, there's a wide range of activities that I address that women participated in.
It's really kind of astounding, both the breadth of what they were doing, and also just I literally don't even know the word for just the kind of ingenuity, I guess, of what they were able to do without any training. I mean, it is very amazing to think about the kind of not just bravery, but kind of creativity on the spot. Courier Girls, I would say, doesn't quite capture it. I love that Hebrew term of kashariyot, the idea of being connectors, because you do get this sense that there's this whole web of the system of resistance in which women play this really essential role. What were some of the reasons why women were good at this, do you think?
Right. So women were good. So many of these resistance activities required leaving the ghetto. It required functioning on the Aryan side, which for Jews meant death. A Jew was not allowed to be on the Aryan side unless they were part of a slave labor group. But Jews couldn't be free on the Aryan side. So whoever was doing this kind of work had to pretend to be Christian, had to pretend to be a Catholic Pole. And for women, this was easier than for men. And there are a few main reasons. One of them is women were not circumcised. Men were circumcised. There was a physical marker of Jewishness on their body. And this was used. If a man was suspected of being Jewish, he was, at gunpoint told to drop his pants. Women didn't have that threat. Women also, and I became very fascinated in this project in the 1930s in Poland, the pre-war era. And in 1930s Poland, which was so much more progressive than I had ever imagined in terms of contemporary standards, women went to school. Women were well educated. School was mandatory in Poland for boys and girls. But in many Jewish families, they sent their sons to Jewish schools, so private schools, yeshivas, even secular Jewish schools, Jewish prep schools, whereas girls they sent to public school. And in these public schools, the girls who then went on to become these resistors in the war, they were acculturated. They were more assimilated. They had Catholic friends. They were aware of the mannerisms, of the prayers. They of even like, gesticulation. Look at me, I'm talking here. So just that that was considered a very Jewish thing. One woman writes about wearing a muff during her undercover work so that she doesn't do that, and it keeps her so there was an awareness of Catholic Polish custom and habit, but there was also, and they talk about this all the time, they learned to speak Polish like a Pole without what they call the creaky Yiddish accent. So they were able to function in Aryan Warsaw. They had the language and they had the awareness of cultural habit that they could then perform much more easily than men. And of course, women were not suspected. Especially Nazi culture was classically very sexist, and these women used that to their advantage. I mean, no one suspected these young, pretty girls of carrying bags of guns.
Right. It's the benefit of being underestimated and overlooked. And you describe some moments where women are actually engaged in fighting, and Nazis are like, exclaiming about it out loud as a woman is shooting them or throwing a Molotov cocktail. They're like, it's a girl, right?
Yeah. In Frau kommt, the Frau kommt. Like, that's what shocks them, that it's a woman.
There's actually a lot of new scholarship that's being done on Jewish women in the 30s, and the dynamics of the fact that young women had a lot more access to secular society and therefore were leaving Orthodoxy, and it was a huge issue. And any of you in the audience who were part of our course where we had a session on Sarah Schneerer will recall that she started the Beis Yaakov movement in part to have a Jewish school opportunity for girls so that they wouldn't secularize in the Polish secular schools, but those skills came in very handy. I wondered also, and I don't know if you found any evidence of this, when I think about the skills that women develop due to the ways that we have to be in the world as women, I think about the fact that women are often need to be very observant of their surroundings, need to learn how to read people. We are more vulnerable and therefore learn how to pay attention to certain kinds of things, need to more so than men, perhaps.
I didn't mention that, but yes, that's part of it too. I think women are trained, even without us knowing it, to read others' cues, to be responsive to others, to make sure we fit in with how others want to see us in a very, I think, deep and subconscious way. And that these are good spy skills. These are good skills for going undercover. You have to preempt and predict. You have to have very strong intuition.
And what about some of the other vulnerabilities that women had in these roles?
Well, I mean, women were vulnerable for obviously sexual attack, sexual violence, which I talk about a bit in the book. Again, there's some new scholarship in the area, but also an extremely underreported side of the story. For these Courier Girls in particular, there were in Poland, there were Poles, they were called schmaltzowniks. They were blackmailers, schmaltz, greasers. Schmaltz is grease, right? So, and if they saw, so the idea was that a lot of Nazis, a lot of Germans, they were foreign. They couldn't really tell who was Jewish and who was Catholic of the Polish people. They didn't have that nuanced radar. But Polish people could tell because of what I'm saying, difference in gesture and language and habit and dress. And there was nuance, but Polish people could often tell. And so some people would call out Jews and say, if you don't pay me 1,000 zlotys, I'm bringing you into the Gestapo office, where he would get a reward for bringing in a Jew, like a bag of sugar sometimes. Women often walked around with money, like right here, so they could give it out. That was part of when they got ready to go out on a mission. They had cash for the schmaltzowniks. to, they knew they were going to be, asked to, greased up for this. But women also, sometimes the blackmailer would say, you better come have sex with me, or come back to my room, or come into that hotel now, or else I'm going to bring you to the Gestapo. So these women were also very vulnerable to that.
And I think it's also important to note that it wasn't only from Poles and Germans that women in the resistance experienced sexual harassment and assault. That there was also, it was complicated in terms of also the ways in which other Jews sometimes expected certain behavior or took advantage of relationships, or wanted to express their own power through who got to be whose girlfriend or boyfriend, and that those relationships were existed even within some of the resistance cells.
Yeah, I touch a little bit on that. And there were certain ghettos and Judenrats that had reputations, like the leader in Łódź, for being sexual predators. But there's so little that's written about it, and it didn't come up in many of the memoirs and testimonies that I was working with. Not to say it didn't happen, but it wasn't written about. So it's not something that I was able to really address in this work.
Yeah, there it's one of the amazing things, as your book shows, is that there are still so many untapped areas for scholarship and research, and that is for sure one of them.
Yeah, people are like, another book about the Holocaust, and yet almost every book I needed to write this didn't exist. Where's the book on 1930s Poland? Where's the book on Jewish women in that? Where's the book? I was very interested in money in the ghettos, money in the war. That was one of the first questions I asked researchers down in the DC Museum, like, give me the book on the ghettos and the money. And they're like, go write that book. Right. Very controversial. And, I tried to pick up information where I could, but.
Right. It's hard. There's so much that's hard to talk about because it falls into either conversations people don't want to have, or it falls into stereotype. And so there are, as you were saying, there are many different things that shape what gets studied and what gets written about at different times. I want to get back to one of the ways that you frame your book, which I found very relatable, which is sort of this, you bring to it, as I think you already mentioned, this, that you have your own personal question about sort of like, how is it that people could not be afraid? How did they run towards danger, as you said? And one of the questions that you frame in the book as being a key question for a lot of the women you were writing about is this debate about whether, as you call it, fight or flight, whether it was better to stay and potentially die fighting, or to escape and live, and all the ways that was framed. And I think about that also in terms of the politics and definitions of resistance. And I'm wondering how, you talked at the very beginning about sort of all the different things that resistance could look like, and all the different kinds of resistance. And how did you think about the many ways to define what resistance actually could be? Whether it, we often think it means sort of fighting, or the more kind of in your face kinds of resistance. But there were so many different ways that people resisted just by existing in some ways.
Well, the idea was all Jews would be dead. So just staying alive in whatever capacity was a form of resistance. Hiding is resistance. Escaping is resistance. Flight is also resistance. As you can see, the book is long, but the early chapters were even longer, the early drafts. And I had a chapter that got cut, but it was about humor in the Holocaust, and the way that even just women, there was a lot of joking around in the camps, in the ghettos, and this humor was so important. It gave people a sense of morale, of community, of camaraderie. And it was a weapon for people that didn't have weapons. There were so many Hitler jokes. Songs and poems and lyrics and caricatures. And there was a flourishing sort of culture of humor as resistance, I believe. So yes, there are many forms. And I was focusing on certain figures in this book. So, and they ended up being of a more physical type resistance. And part of that was um, because I felt that that story really hadn't been told very much about women. So that ended up being more of the focus. But yes, I think all these forms count.
Yeah, and it is interesting to think, sort of in some ways as we get there, now that I think we often have this sort of somberness associated with the Holocaust, as if it's an area that doesn't allow for humor, and it is kind of expanding to think about the ways in which that was allowed in the moment in a way that it may not be now.
I mean, when I first became interested in that Yiddish book, of course it was the stories and the content that jolted me, but it was also the tone. These women weren't sad. It, it was not stayed in the way that the Holocaust narrative tonally felt to me for a long time. These were stories, they were furious. Their writing was passionate. They were witty. They were so alive on the page. These were stories of movement. These were women jumping off trains and dyeing their hair and getting dressed up. And there was so much action, so much movement, and so much emotion that was not sadness. And I think really that's what surprised me when I found this dusty old Yiddish book with the blue cover that I thought would be doom. Doom would be the tone, and that was not the tone. The
Right.
tone was energy and anger and passion.
So tell us a little bit about some of the stories that you found, and maybe actually if you want to show some of the images that you have, that would be great to give us a sense of who some of these women were that you were uncovering.
You have to control me because I can talk about these women for so long that let's get started with one or two and then we'll see. Oh, all right. Is that working?
Yep.
All right. So this is a photograph. This is in the book. The book has 32 photographs. I mean, I loved finding the photographs. And this is of a youth movement in Bialystok in 1938. And the woman second to the right with the amazing fur collar is Frumka Plotnicka, who I mean, it like makes me cry to talk about her because I feel so like I feel so strongly about her story. She was a leader in the youth movements in Warsaw before the war in the 30s. She, when war hit in 39, like many of the youth movements, she went east across the border. She ended up in Belarusian territory. She was safe. She was posted near her parents in Pinsk, but she couldn't take it. She felt like she couldn't take having fled the crisis. She really felt responsible to her community. So she was the first person in the youth movements, and the youth movements were big ways of structuring society. They were large organizations. She was the first leader to smuggle herself back into Nazi-occupied Poland. She went to Warsaw. She became a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto, setting up soup kitchens. As I was saying, cultural programs, education. She did have Jewish features, so she would tie a kerchief around her face, travel through the country at every step at risk of death, giving lectures and seminars in other ghettos, bringing educational materials from their underground printing presses. They were printing plays and essays and anthologies. And then when the youth movements became more militias, when they transformed in late 41, early 42, she was one of the first people to smuggle weapons into the Warsaw Ghetto. She smuggled guns in a sack of potatoes, under potatoes. She was then posted to this town of Begin, where she ended up being a main leader of the underground, basically planned the whole defense. And I'll give it away. She was killed. She was killed when the ghetto was liquidated. She was killed shooting Nazis from a bunker, literally, gun in hand. I should also say numerous times in the war, she was offered papers to leave Poland, and she never accepted it. And she felt she had to stay and fight for her people. She was actually awarded a medal from the Polish government shortly after the war for her military service to the country. But somehow she didn't make it into any Jewish history that I had ever heard. So there's my long brief on Frumka Plotnicka. Should I keep going?
Yeah, keep
going. So this is my central character, Renia Kukielka. She was, Frumka was from more of a Hasidic working class family who then became secular, whereas Renia was a more middle class and not as, her family was not as religious to begin with. And she actually wasn't in the youth movement. She joined during the war when they needed someone to go to Warsaw from the town that she was in, and she looked good. She looked Polish. So she dressed up, put cash in her garter belt, and was off on mission. She ended up doing several missions between Warsaw and this town of Bydgoszcz, collecting information, arranging buses to take Jews out of ghettos, going to cemeteries, meeting with arms dealers, buying guns, transporting people to safety, and we go on. I'm trying to like not tell you everything.
Right, you don't want all the spoilers.
Don't give it. Should I share one more, two more? Or,
yeah, share a couple more.
These are 3 Courier Girls, and the middle one, Bella Hasan, was posted by the underground in the town of Grodno, and she needed a job because to be a young Polish woman about town, you have to have a job. You have to be doing something. So she went to the employment agency and was applying for a job. Like, oh, we have the perfect job for you. Great. What is it? She's going to be basically a receptionist for the Gestapo. So she gets a job working in Gestapo headquarters and stealing their documents. She steals them. She brings them to the underground, who had, these makeshift forgery bureaus so that could copy all these documents. And she ends up also being a weapons smuggler. But this photo was taken, one of the men in the office had a crush on her. And he invited her to the Christmas party one year. And that night, these 2 other amazing Courier Girls, Tama Schneiderman and Lanka Kazabrodska, were staying with her. And so she couldn't say no. You didn't say no. That would seem weird. That would set something off. You couldn't arouse any kind of suspicion. So so this is a photo of 3 Jewish girls disguised as Christian Poles at a Gestapo Christmas party in 1941.
It's kind of unbelievable. And you can see in this picture how young these are. I mean, really, in so many cases, you're really talking about teenagers who were in these roles.
Renia was my sort of central character, was 18. They were all about around 20. Lanka was a little older on the right here. She was about 25. That was old in this group.
Maybe one more if you have one.
Oh, I have. This is Vladka Mead, and this is a photograph taken in 1944 in central Warsaw. She is, again, disguised as a Christian girl out on, a day of theater and lunch. Really, she was another smuggler of dynamite and weapons. She was a major courier. At this time during the war, she was working on rescue organizations. That organization helped about 12,000 Jews in hiding in Warsaw alone. She would bring money. I mean, the bags were like, probably that handbag was filled with money. She was bringing money to pay these hiders. She had to move people if the hiding spots became dangerous. She was bringing them medical help, trusted photographers to take photos of them for fake IDs. I mean, I don't know if you could see wearing a watch, but one of the, they couldn't keep records. These are underground organizations, but yet they had to have some paperwork because they were dealing with a lot of people. So everyone had fake names, fake street addresses. Everything was coded, and they used to keep records of who they paid off for what in little tiny sheets of paper that they would slip under their watches. And yeah, that was the record keeping. I could go on, but
and I want to get back to the record keeping piece, but I have one question I want to ask from the chat. There's some other questions in the chat I will pull in as well. But when you talk about smuggling people out of the ghetto, how do you? I mean, it's one can imagine how you smuggle papers or money, or how you can even bring in arms and other things in and out. But how does one smuggle people?
Basically, it's leading them out of the ghetto from whatever ways you found to exit the ghetto. And there were different techniques for how these women went in and out of the ghettos. So taking people with you and bringing them wherever. So obviously they had to be in disguise as well. They had to also be pretending to be Christian, or depending if we were taking them on a train somewhere, they certainly had to be in disguise. There was one example, Zelda Traeger was working out near Vilna. She did 17 trips where she would take people out of slave labor camps into forests. So going at night, finding ways out of these camps and literally walking them to areas where there were either Jewish partisan groups or other settlements in the forest where they could be hidden.
And Emily asked how they got their stylish outfits, which obviously were key to being able to pass.
So they borrowed them, they bought them. They talk about budgets for this clothing. And yeah, it was very important. They had to look stylish. They had to look upper middle class, because who else would be out and about during the day in wartime?
So, you talked about how hard record keeping was. So that was hard, I'm sure, not only for them keeping track of their dealings, but also for historians coming afterwards and people who want to write about these stories. So, you told us at the beginning about finding the first book that was kind of the key, but tell us more about your research process and sort of how did you find all of this, track people down, figure out who they had, all these different names plus all the different spellings. How did you figure out who was who and find out what their stories were?
Well, that's why this project took so long. Well, that's part of why it took so long. The other parts were my own emotional reluctance to deal with some of the material. But this was a lot of detective work. And it was, getting my hands really into it. And I found these original bits of writing. I had to figure out who these people were. This is also where the Jewish Women's Archive Encyclopedia of Women was so helpful, because it had entries on some of these women. And someone had written a bit about them, brief, sometimes even longer, biographical sketches, and I would look at and be like, oh, that name matches. It's not exactly, but wait, I think the story matches. I was reading in Yiddish, so the names were like Rachel, which is not the same as Rushka, which is not the same as Rivka, but it's all the same person. And so it was very tricky, and I would have to really read their accounts, read many accounts, and then once I started reading a lot, things started to, I was like, oh wait, I read about Astrid in this other diary. Oh wait, is Estreet the same as Astrid? Wait a minute. And then I would go back and see all the mentions. I'm like, oh yeah, she complained that she was too into the dresses, and she also complained that must be the same woman in these two diaries. Oh, so there was a bit of, actually a lot of the early work was this kind of detectiving, sleuthing, to figure out who these people were and just finding out more about them. But many of them did write or leave oral or video testimonies. Some were written in the 40s, and some were written or recorded often in the 90s. So I was often using first-person sources from both those eras. And those are different types of tellings as well.
And I know you knew Yiddish, but did you also know any Polish?
No, I know no Polish, and I had a Polish translator here in New York who I worked with, and people in Poland who were helping me there too.
So you talked about how long it took you to write this book, and obviously it's a lot of work to do all of this tracking down, and I know you also track down, relatives of people and their children and grandchildren, which is interesting, and I'm sure was meaningful. But it's also, tough to live. I can imagine how hard it was to live with this content day in, day out. Even just reading the book felt that way a little bit. I mean, it's a gripping book, and I highly recommend that everybody buy it and read it. These are super important stories to know, and it is shocking as you're going about your day to day. I'm like looking at my 14-year-old complaining about having lost her phone, and I'm thinking, huh. In another lifetime, you would have been, alone, trying to figure out how to escape, and having to be super wily and not having me try to find your things for you. And it just the cognitive dissonance is heartbreaking. How did you live with this for so long? How did you manage that challenge?
Well, part of it is it took so long, part for many reasons, but part of it was because I wasn't ready. And when I found that book, Freud into Ghettos, in 2007, I was 30. I was single. I was living in London. I was working in the art world. Like, honestly, the last place I wanted to spend my afternoons was Warsaw, 1943. I was running away. The whole reason I was in London was I was running away from my family, whose trauma felt overbearing to me. And then, of course, I find exactly what I'm running away from. But, it took me the first number of years. First, I got a translation grant to translate the material from the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, supported the translation. And I thought it would take, working it full time for a few months, whatever. And it took me like 5 years, because I worked on it like a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, because I actually couldn't. It was too difficult. And it took till much later in my life, I was much more stable and just felt more, both emotionally, just more stable to really be able to dive into these stories.
I want to go back a little bit. You made sort of reference in passing as you were talking about some of the women that they were part of various youth organizations, and many of the women that you write about were part of these Zionist youth organizations. So tell us a little bit about the role of these youth groups in forming the kind of organizational backbone of the resistance.
Most of the women I write about here were from Zionist youth, socialist Zionist youth organizations, and a few were from socialist Bundist youth organizations as well. But I'm really generally writing about the socialist organizations in this book, because that's who was represented in this original Yiddish book and sort of what led me into the story. But there were, so part of the 1930s that I'm now obsessed with, the structuring of society, of Jewish society, was through a number of political parties. And these parties had different approaches to handling the diaspora question of, am I Jewish? Am I Polish? They had different approaches to that. And these parties each had youth groups that were generally affiliated, literally affiliated or philosophically affiliated with these political parties. And 100,000 Jewish youths were part of the youth group movement. I don't know what percent that is, because the age isn't clear, so I can't figure out a percent number, but it's a significant number of Jewish youth. And these youth groups were their training grounds: spiritual, intellectual, emotional. The groups I write about, they read psychoanalysis, they were self-critical, they learned about their self-awareness, their strengths, their weaknesses, they learned how to work collectively, they were all about the collective, pride, Jewish pride, values of self-sufficiency, physicality, there was athletics as well as agriculture. And they were, and I actually think these youth groups trained these women to be able, I think the reason these groups became militias more easily in the ghettos is because they already, also many Jews left their family homes to move in to kibbutzim, which were all over Poland, which I didn't know about. And they lived with each other already. They lived in these collectives. So even when they were in the ghettos, they knew how to live together. They knew how to work together. They trusted each other. And much of that training, which was socialist, hippie, bohemian training, ended up serving them in becoming guerrilla fighting units.
Right, and some of them had even been sort of preparing in sort of self-defense. Not really militia-style self-defense in preparation for making Aliyah. So they had very rudimentary, obviously, skills, but they were thinking in that direction.
And even in the Bundists who planned on staying in Poland also had defense units because they were going to stay in Poland. So they were going to defend the community in Poland. So both of these socialist groups, yes, they had studied, and women led some of these self-defense units. So
right.
Before the war.
And it gave them purpose and family when their families were killed and when they needed that organizational purpose.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I get to some of the questions in the audience. There was a question earlier from Ellen about the age range for this book, and that's a great opportunity for you to talk also about the middle grade version of the book.
There is a middle grade version of the book. It's the blue version, and this is intended for ages 10 to 14 plus. And I wrote it with somebody who writes for that age group. I generally don't. So I was very scared about it. But I wrote it with someone who writes for that age group. And so if you're looking for something for a younger age, I would recommend this, but it does require knowledge of the Holocaust. This doesn't explain the Holocaust, but it tells the stories of these women. It's a shorter book. It has fewer characters. It has less history, less sort of explorations of 1930s Poland, for instance. It's a bit more narrative, but it's the same kishkas, the same guts as the adult version.
There was another question I was going to ask you that just flew out of my head. But Chaya just asked a question about whether you had new information to give the families of these women. So maybe that's an opportunity to talk a little bit about what it was like to meet some of their children and grandchildren and what they knew.
Some of the families knew a lot, and a lot of the families knew nothing or very little. And for instance, Renya's family, who has been so supportive and incredible in this whole project, I send them information about her all the time. And since this project went public a couple of weeks ago, I've gotten the outpouring of emails and messages about other people who's had family in the resistance and didn't know, and do I know about their mother? And it turns out that even Renya has a whole branch of the family in the US who didn't know anything about her. And now I'm like making shidduchs and matchmakers between all these families because they're like, wait, that's our name. Wait, is she related to so-and-so? I was like, yes. They're like, that's our cousin, So in some families, it was more discussed. Some of these women became Holocaust educators. They worked in Holocaust museums, and they were more involved in that community and in the telling of the story. And others were more of the, I need to do something completely different with my life. And so for some of them, I've been providing information.
I thought it was also interesting the kind of different generational relationships there, that some people who really had told almost nothing to their children actually opened up to their grandchildren in different ways.
And I feel like many of these women started opening up to their grandchildren. And that's why you have, I feel, this in the 1990s. That's why, for various reasons, more of these memoirs started being written in the 1990s, the 2000s. Also, these women realized that they were getting older and that if they were going to ever tell the story, they had to do it now. And also grandchildren, there was a less fraught relationship with grandchildren. And grandchildren, I read quite a bit about this, felt the 3 Gs felt much more pride in the story of their grandparents, survivors, whereas the children of survivors often felt quite a lot of shame, growing up with often refugee foreign parents who didn't speak the language and were very different. So the experience of the generations was different.
Rochelle asked a question earlier about numbers of people who survived, and I wonder if you also could say something about numbers in general. Like, how many resistors and female resistors are we talking about here?
Numbers are really, really difficult. These were underground guerrilla operations. As I was saying before, the few records that were kept were there were coded strands of paper stuffed under a watch. And even any records that were kept, they were fudged on purpose so that if everything was coded, so that if anything was found, you wouldn't be able to track people down. I mean, if they found out you were a Jew, they would kill you. If they found out you were a Jew as part of the resistance, they would torture you and kill you. Like, people couldn't keep. There weren't archives. Well, there was the war. There were archives in the ghettos, but not of the resistance. So it's I can tell you numbers based on whatever I feel is the most solid research that I've read, but even then I think you have to take it with someone asked me the other day how many Nazis were killed in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I don't know how many. Who is keeping count? Like, who? These were teenagers shooting from rooftops and then fleeing into bunkers. And certainly the Nazis weren't keeping count. And if they were going to downplay the numbers. So we don't, these numbers are often estimates based on research and but it's tricky.
And in terms of the women that you write about, some of them survive and some of them don't. I mean, it felt there were certainly many survivors, and that may be that those were the people who were able to write down their stories. So,
I mean, my book is weighed heavily towards people that survived because I was able to. They left information. There were a couple of diaries from the war, but mostly, these accounts were produced after the war, and then they had families and they had people I could talk to. So. As a historian, you can only work with what source material you have.
Right, of course. Dorothy asks about whether this is becoming a film, and yes, we know that it is. So, is there anything you can tell us about that?
Well, we are working on it. It has been it was optioned. This was a while ago by Steven Spielberg's company Amblin, and a screenplay has been commissioned, and I'm one of the writers on the screenplay, but it's still very early stages, so fingers crossed.
It's exciting. We will look forward to encountering Renya and some of the others on screen. There's so much here. There's so many more things I wish we could talk about, but I'm so glad that you wrote this book and that this book exists. And, saving stories is a form of resistance. It's political. You've described that very clearly. And it's how I think about your work. It's how I think about the work of JWA too. So I want to thank you for uncovering these stories and for lifting them up and returning them to the narrative. One of the things in the book that you describe again and again and so beautifully is how hard it was for the people who were hiding on the Aryan side to have to live in, not just how hard it was to hold up their performance 24/7, but also just not to be known for who they really were. And you write at one point of Bela Hasan, who maintained her Polish disguise even at Auschwitz, that I think what you said was to be known was to be. And I kept thinking as I was reading the book that by helping us know these women, you've helped them live on and continue to exist in our memory, in our history. And I'm so grateful for that. So thank you very much, Judy.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your encyclopedia again, without which it was a huge part of my early research work. Really, it was really, really essential.
I'm so glad.
Thank you, JWA.
Thanks to all of you also for being with us tonight. I hope you will join us next week, same time, same place, for a conversation with Jessica Cohen, the translator of lots of Israeli fiction, including And the Bride Closed the Door, as well as many novels by David Grossman. We will be talking about the art and politics of literary translation. And next Thursday, also, for those of you paying attention to the calendar, is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. So it's a fitting time to be talking about Israeli literature and translation. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out the many, many resources we have in our digital archive at jwa.org. For those of you who don't know the rest of the work we do, actually, these programs are just a tiny piece of it. We have so much more. The encyclopedia, as Judy mentioned, a podcast, which we also interviewed Judy for, and you can check that out. I also it was bringing to mind also our conversation tonight, our podcast interview maybe a year or so ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago, with Irene Butter, who was a survivor who didn't tell her story for about 50 years, and then in the 90s started to tell her story and eventually wrote a memoir. But there's so much more material on our site to discover, help you gain insight on the diversity of the Jewish story, including encyclopedia essays on women in the resistance and kashariot. And we just put the links to those in the chat. But if you look at those entries, you will see that they link to many other entries. There were so many individual essays on women that Judy mentions in the book, too many to link here. So you'll have to read the book and click through some of those on your own. It was wonderful to be with all of you tonight. Until next time, be well and have a good night and a good week. Take care, everybody.